Paris, November 12, 1942. A German logistics officer by the name of Hauptmann Werner Dietz is standing on the platform of the Gare de Lyon, watching a freight train being loaded with crates bound for the Eastern Front. The morning is cold. The platform smells of coal smoke and damp stone. Around him, Wehrmacht guards move with the practiced boredom of men who have been doing the same job for 2 years and expect to do it for 2 more. Nobody is alarmed. Nobody is watching the civilian railway worker who spent 20 minutes in the locomotive cab this morning, apparently fixing a problem with a pressure gauge. Nobody noticed what he left behind. A small, gray-green block, perhaps the size of a bar of hotel soap, pressed carefully into a crevice behind the firebox. It has no wires, no timer that ticks, no fuse that can be seen or smelled or feared. It looks, to anyone who might glance at it, like nothing at all. The train leaves Paris at 07:43. It never arrives at Lyon. What destroyed that locomotive, and what was at that moment being smuggled across occupied Europe in false-bottom suitcases, stitched into the linings of coats, molded into candles and lumps of coal and bars of genuine washing soap, was a substance that the Special Operations Executive had spent 3 years perfecting, adapting, and deploying with an almost theatrical creativity. It was not a gun, it was not a bomb, in the traditional sense. It was, in fact, a plastic explosive, specifically the compound known as Nobel 808, and later the improved formulation that would become Composition C, and in the hands of the SOE's agents, saboteurs, and resistance coordinators, it became perhaps the most versatile and psychologically destabilizing weapon in the British irregular warfare arsenal. This is not, strictly speaking, a story about soap. It is a story about what happens when a democratic nation, stripped of conventional military options in occupied territory, turns to chemistry, improvisation, and the peculiar genius of people who have nothing left to lose. It is a story about the gap between what a weapon looks like and what it can do. And it is, above all, a story about how a pliable block of explosive material, one that could be kneaded like bread dough, sculpted like clay, and carried through a German checkpoint in a woman's shopping basket, changed the nature of clandestine warfare in ways that are still felt in the doctrine of every Special Forces unit operating today. To understand why the SOE needed such a weapon, you must first understand the situation that Britain found itself in during the summer of 1940. The fall of France in June of that year did not merely represent a military catastrophe. It represented the complete collapse of conventional Allied power on the European continent. Norway had fallen. The Low Countries had fallen. By July, the only territory in Western Europe not under German occupation or the shadow of German alliance stretched essentially from the white cliffs of Dover to the Scottish Highlands. The idea of conventional military operations, infantry assaults, artillery bombardment, the organized advance of armored formations, was not merely impractical. It was fantasy. Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister for fewer than 6 weeks when France surrendered, understood this with brutal clarity. On July 22, 1940, he signed the executive order creating the Special Operations Executive, the organization whose mandate he summarized in a phrase that has since become one of the most quoted in the history of irregular warfare: to set Europe ablaze. The SOE would recruit, train, and insert agents into occupied territory. They would organize resistance networks. They would disrupt German logistics, destroy infrastructure, and make the occupation of Europe as expensive, exhausting, and demoralizing as human ingenuity could manage. But they needed tools. The problem with most conventional explosives, TNT being the obvious example, was that they were extraordinarily difficult to move. TNT in block form is rigid, heavy, chemically unstable under certain conditions, and unmistakably recognizable. A German customs officer who found a block of TNT in your luggage was not going to ask questions. Neither, for that matter, was the Gestapo officer he immediately telephoned. Gelignite, the standard commercial explosive of the era, was similarly problematic. It was sensitive to shock, degraded badly in extreme temperatures, and had a smell, a sharp, distinctive nitroglycerin odor that a trained dog could detect from considerable distance. The SOE's agents were not operating in ideal conditions. They were crossing borders, riding trains, cycling through checkpoints, and living in houses that the Gestapo might decide to search at 3 o'clock on any given morning. They needed an explosive that behaved like anything other than an explosive. Nobel 808, manufactured by Nobel's Explosives Company at Ardere in Ayrshire, Scotland, was not a new invention in 1940. The compound had been developed in the late 1930s as a commercial industrial explosive, and its basic formulation had been known to chemists for some years. What made it revolutionary was not its raw explosive power. In terms of sheer destructive force per kilogram, it was broadly comparable to TNT, but its physical properties. Nobel 808 was, in plain terms, plastic. Not plastic in the modern sense of the word, but plastic in the technical sense. Moldable, malleable, capable of being worked by hand into any shape required and retaining that shape without any support structure. You could roll it into a ball. You could press it flat. You could work it around a pipe, into a crevice, along a seam of metal where two structural members joined. And unlike gelignite, it was extraordinarily stable. You could drop it. You could set it on fire, and it would burn with a slow, waxy flame, but it would not explode. Detonating it required a blasting cap or a detonator pencil, which the SOE was also producing in quantity. Without that initiating charge, 808 was, for all practical purposes, inert. The color was a gray-green, not unlike putty or modeling clay. The smell was unusual, a faintly sweet, almond-like odor that chemists would later identify as coming from the cyclonite, RDX, that formed its primary energetic component, combined with the mineral oil and plasticizing agents that gave it its workable consistency. To the uninitiated nose, it smelled vaguely of marzipan. Not of danger, not of death. The SOE's Station 9, the research and development facility housed at the Fryth, a country house near Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire, was responsible for adapting this industrial product into something an agent could carry through occupied France without raising a German eyebrow. The scientists and engineers working under the directorship of Major John Dolphin and later under the remarkable Colin Gubbins were not, for the most part, conventionally military men. They were chemists, engineers, physicists, and a handful of genuinely eccentric individuals who seemed to take a particular pleasure in disguising deadly things as harmless ones. The leap from industrial explosive to clandestine weapon required solving a specific problem: concealment. The SOE's answer was, in retrospect, so obvious as to seem almost comically simple. If 808 could be molded into any shape, then it could be molded into the shape of something innocent. And so it was. The compound was pressed into molds to produce bars visually identical to common brands of household soap, complete, in some cases, with manufacturers' stamps pressed into the surface. It was cast into the shapes of coal lumps and mixed with genuine coal in locomotive tenders across occupied Europe, where it would travel directly into the firebox and produce a detonation far beyond anything a normal fire could generate. It was formed into candles, into blocks of butter wrapped in greaseproof paper, into lumps of what appeared to be bread dough, and at least once, according to the records held at the National Archives in Kew, into a convincing replica of a rat, on the theory that no German NCO would willingly pick up a dead rat to examine it closely. The manufacturing process at Ardere was prodigious. Production figures for Nobel 808 remain partially classified, but estimates drawn from post-war logistics records suggest that the SOE received somewhere in the region of 50 to 70 tons of the compound between 1941 and 1945, with significant additional quantities supplied directly to resistance organizations via parachute drops. Each standard drop canister, the cylindrical metal containers known as C-types that were pushed out of Halifaxes and Stirlings at low altitude over moonlit fields in France, Belgium, Norway, and the Netherlands, could carry approximately 35 to 40 kilograms of 808, along with detonators, time delay pencils, and a printed instruction sheet that the recipient was expected to memorize and destroy. The time delay pencil itself deserves brief mention because it was as important to the 808's operational utility as the explosive itself. Developed at Station 12 at Aston House in Hertfordshire, the pencil was a slender brass tube containing a glass ampule of cupric chloride solution. When the agent pressed the pencil between their fingers, they broke the ampule, releasing the acid. The acid then ate through a wire under tension. When the wire snapped, it released a spring-loaded striker that fired a detonator. The delay between pressing the pencil and the resulting explosion depended on the temperature of the environment and the gauge of the wire. But pencils were color-coded: black for a 10-minute delay, red for 30 minutes, yellow for 1 hour, green for 6 hours, and white for anywhere between 12 and 24 hours. An agent could sabotage a piece of industrial equipment and be on a train to Marseille before anyone realized anything had gone wrong. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational record of Nobel 808 and its successor formulations is, necessarily, incomplete. Resistance networks kept poor records, for excellent reasons, and many operations were never reported at all, either because the agent did not survive or because the success spoke loudly enough for itself. What the historical record does preserve is a catalog of remarkable operations that demonstrate both the compound's versatility and the ingenuity of the people using it. In Norway, SOE-trained company-link saboteurs used 808 to destroy the electrolysis cells at the Wehrmacht heavy water plant in February 1943. The famous Gunnerside operation, placing shaped charges with a precision that maximized damage to irreplaceable equipment whilst minimizing structural collapse that might have injured Norwegian workers. In France, the wheelwright circuit under George Starr coordinated the disruption of railway lines supplying German reinforcements following the D-Day landings, with 808-equipped Maquis teams destroying an estimated 37 locomotives in the Gers and Lot-et-Garonne departments in the 6 weeks following June 1944. In Denmark, the Holger Danske resistance organization used the compound so effectively against Danish industrial facilities working for the German war effort that the Gestapo's own internal reports, captured after the liberation, described the situation as unmanageable. The psychological effect extended beyond the individual explosions. The knowledge that an explosive material could look identical to an everyday household object, and that the enemy possessed it in quantity and the skill to deploy it, produced what German security services described in their reports as a generalized anxiety about the material world. Inspectors at checkpoints who had once waved lorries of soap and provisions through with minimal examination began pulling open crates, squeezing loaves of bread, and examining lumps of coal by hand. This consumed time and manpower. It created friction. It spread the anxiety through German logistics networks in a way that no conventional bomb could have achieved. Germany's own plastic explosive program is worth examining by comparison. The Wehrmacht and SS both employed a compound known as Sprengstoff 39, and later a formulation called Nipolite, which bore certain similarities to 808 in its moldable properties. However, the German compound suffered from a significant drawback. They were considerably more sensitive to shock and friction than 808, which made them hazardous to transport and store in field conditions. More critically, the German program lacked the SOE's institutional emphasis on disguise and concealment. Sprengstoff 39 was, in essence, a military explosive that happened to be moldable. The SOE's 808 was a disguised weapon that happened to be explosive. The philosophical difference was significant, and it produced practical differences in operational deployment that tilted the balance of clandestine effectiveness firmly toward the British. The Americans, for their part, were developing their own formulations in parallel. The compound known as Composition C, which American chemists at the Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey were refining through 1942 and 1943, was in some respects superior to 808 in raw explosive power, and the later Composition C4, still in widespread military use today, became the standard plastic explosive of the Western world. The SOE itself transitioned partly to American-supplied Composition C from 1944 onwards as supply lines across the Atlantic became more reliable. But the creative doctrine of disguise and deception, the coal lump, the soap bar, the dead rat, was British in origin, British in development, and British in its most sophisticated application. The legacy of Nobel 808 and the SOE's explosive disguise program is difficult to assess in purely material terms. Historians of the Second World War continue to debate the extent to which SOE operations materially shortened the conflict, and the honest answer is that certainty remains elusive. What is not debatable is the compound's influence on the theory and practice of irregular warfare. The concept of a weapon that looks like nothing at all, that passes through the hands of the enemy unrecognized, became a cornerstone of Special Forces doctrine in every Western military that emerged from the war. The SAS, the SBS, the American Special Forces, the Israeli Sayeret, all inherited a tradition of creative sabotage that owed a direct intellectual debt to the scientists at the E.H. Freith and the manufacturing chemists at Ardeer. One further dimension of the legacy is worth noting. The disguised nature of 808-based weapons created a legal and ethical gray area that military lawyers were still working through decades after the war ended. A combatant who carried a conventional weapon, a rifle, a grenade, was, under the laws of war, a recognizable combatant. A civilian who carried soap that was not soap occupied a far more ambiguous position, and the German response to captured SOE agents, execution under the Commando Befehl Order of October 1942, reflected the anxiety that irregular disguised warfare produced in a military culture that prized the clean boundaries of uniformed conflict. The SOE and its agents operated outside those boundaries by necessity and by design, and the plastic explosive was the material embodiment of that choice. Surviving examples of Nobel 808 remain exceedingly rare, for obvious reasons. The Imperial War Museum in London holds a small display relating to the SOE's materiel, including examples of the time delay pencil and some of the disguised weapon forms. The SOE archive, transferred to the National Archives at Kew after the organization's dissolution in 1946, contains operational records that remain partially redacted but provide the most complete picture available to civilian historians. The Ardeer site in Ayrshire, where 808 was manufactured, operated as an explosives facility until 2014 and has since been partially redeveloped. A small commemorative display acknowledges its wartime role. Return for a moment to that platform at the Gare de Lyon, to the railway worker walking away at an unhurried pace, to the locomotive pulling out into the cold November air, carrying its cargo of German military materiel east toward a front that was already beginning, though nobody on that platform knew it yet, to turn against the Reich. The worker did not carry a gun. He did not wear a uniform. He did not throw a grenade or fire an artillery piece or do any of the things that the history books traditionally associate with acts of war. He carried a block of gray-green material roughly the size of a bar of soap, pressed it into place with his bare hands, and walked away. The compound he used had been manufactured in a country house in Hertfordshire, shipped across occupied territory in a false-bottomed case, and passed through at least 2 German checkpoints without raising a flicker of suspicion. The locomotive did not arrive at Lyon. The crates it carried did not reach the Eastern Front. and somewhere in occupied Paris a network of ordinary people, a schoolteacher, a pharmacist, a railway mechanic, a woman who sold vegetables from a market stall, continued their invisible war against the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen, armed with a substance that looked like nothing, that smelled faintly of almonds, and that could, in the right hands, stop a train. Britain in 1940 had lost an army, lost a continent, and stared across the Channel at an enemy that controlled everything from the Atlantic coast to the suburbs of Moscow. What it did not lose was the capacity for a particular kind of ingenuity, the willingness to look at an industrial chemical product, a bar of soap, a lump of coal, a dead rat, and ask, "What can this become?" The SOE's answer to that question shaped the practice of clandestine warfare for the next 80 years. The soap that could kill a man never looked like a weapon. That was, of course, precisely the point.